In the high-stakes world of Formula One in 2026, where every tenth of a second can make or break a championship challenge, a sophisticated technical exploit involving the MGU-K system briefly gave Mercedes and Red Bull a subtle but meaningful edge in qualifying, until the FIA stepped in to close the loophole following careful scrutiny and proactive engagement from Ferrari. The regulations introduced for the 2026 season included a very specific safety requirement for the MGU-K, the electric motor that delivers up to 350 kW of additional power. As a car nears the end of a qualifying lap and its battery energy begins to run low, the rules strictly mandate a controlled power ramp down at a rate of 50 kilowatts per second. This gradual reduction was designed to prevent a sudden, cliff-edge drop in performance that could create dangerous speed differences between cars on the track, something that has already been visible in the opening races of the year. Yet buried within the same set of technical regulations was an important exception. If the MGU-K needed to be shut down immediately due to a genuine technical fault, an emergency situation, or a component protection trigger, the mandatory ramp down did not have to be followed. In such cases, the system could be cut instantly for safety reasons. It was this precise exception that the clever engineers at Mercedes and Red Bull identified and turned into a competitive tool. They developed a method to deliberately activate what was internally referred to as the continuous offset or emergency shutdown function right at the very end of a qualifying lap. By triggering this mode in the final few seconds before crossing the timing line, their cars could continue running at maximum MGU-K deployment without being forced to follow the 50 kW per second reduction. The beauty of the trick from a performance perspective was that it carried almost no operational downside. Once the car had crossed the finish line for the purposes of the lap time, the driver was already transitioning to the cooldown lap back to the pits. At that point, maintaining full electrical power was no longer necessary for competitive reasons, and abruptly cutting the MGU-K posed no safety risk because the car was slowing down anyway. This allowed the cars to enjoy an extra burst of power, estimated by sources to be somewhere between 50 and 100 kW, for those critical final seconds of the lap. At most circuits, this translated into small but valuable time gains of just a few fractions of a second. However, at tracks with longer straights leading up to the timing line, the benefit became noticeably larger. Miami, with its extended final straight, stood out as a circuit where the advantage would have been at the higher end of that range. The technique first became visible during the Australian Grand Prix weekend, the opening round of the 2026 season. Teams that were monitoring data closely enough quickly noticed that both Mercedes and Red Bull were running this MGU-K shutdown mode at the end of their qualifying efforts. It continued to be used through the Chinese Grand Prix and was still in play when the circus arrived in Japan. Ferrari, however, took a markedly different approach than the traditional, if it's legal, copy it, philosophy that has defined much of Formula One's competitive history. Instead of rushing to implement the same software mode in their own cars, Ferrari chose to open a direct line of communication with the FIA. Their questions were not primarily about whether the trick was legal. They accepted that it technically complied with the written regulations, but rather about whether the repeated and systematic use of an emergency shutdown function for pure performance gain was in the spirit of the safety rule it was exploiting, especially given the unintended side effects that were starting to emerge. This decision by Ferrari revealed a sophisticated strategic assessment of the situation. The performance upside of the trick was heavily dependent on the layout of each circuit. On tracks where the distance from the final corner to the timing line was short, such as the tight final chicane at Suzuka or the layout in Shanghai, the time benefit was minimal and arguably not worth the potential complications. On high-speed circuits with long run-ins to the line, including Baku, Monza, and particularly Miami, the gains would have been far more significant. The situation came to a head during practice sessions at Suzuka, one of the most demanding and technical circuits in the world. Both Mercedes driver Kimi Antonelli and Red Bull's Max Verstappen experienced clear problems where the 60-second MGU-K lockout period, intended as a deterrent against abusing the emergency shutdown, left their cars with insufficient electrical power through the high-speed Esses section in the middle of the lap. The issue even spread to customer teams, with Williams' Alex Albon being forced to stop on track entirely due to related power complications. What had started as a clever qualifying advantage had now created visible reliability and safety concerns during active practice sessions at a venue where precision and consistent power delivery are essential. Following discussions with the FIA in Japan, Mercedes made the pragmatic decision to deactivate the system for the remainder of the Suzuka event. The gains at that particular track were relatively small due to the short final sector, and the growing visibility of the problems made continuing with the technique unsustainable. Meanwhile, the conversations that Ferrari had already begun with the governing body continued, and eventually led to the formal ban that was issued this week, just 10 days before the Miami Grand Prix. The new technical directive does not eliminate the emergency shutdown function entirely. It remains available for its intended purpose: genuine technical emergencies where immediate shutdown is necessary to protect the car or driver. What has been removed is the ability to use that function in a planned, systematic way at the end of qualifying laps purely for competitive advantage. From the Miami Grand Prix onward, the FIA will be actively monitoring telemetry data from the final moments of qualifying laps. Any activation of the emergency shutdown mode will need to be backed up by clear evidence of a genuine technical issue. Otherwise, it will not be accepted. In practical terms, this means the mandatory 50 kW per second rampdown will once again apply to every car as they approach the timing line. The competitive impact of this change is distinctly one-sided. Mercedes and Red Bull are losing a small but real qualifying tool that they had been successfully exploiting. Teams such as Ferrari and McLaren, which had chosen not to adopt the trick, are not gaining any new performance but are also not losing anything. The net result is a slightly more level qualifying field. Particularly at circuits like Miami, where the long final straight would have amplified the original advantage. This MGU-K shutdown ban does not exist in isolation. It forms part of a wider pattern of regulatory adjustments that appear to be systematically addressing elements of Mercedes' early 2026 dominance. The controversial compression ratio manufacturing loophole that gave Mercedes a structural advantage in power output is already scheduled to be closed starting from the Monaco Grand Prix in June. Separate discussions are also taking place this week around potential changes to the super clipping harvesting parameters, which could reduce the effectiveness of the advanced energy management strategies Mercedes has developed over years of Formula E competition. While each individual regulatory tweak is relatively modest and unlikely to close the performance gap overnight, the cumulative direction is unmistakable. The combination of manufacturing exploits, software loopholes in emergency systems, and deep institutional knowledge from other racing series that initially favored Mercedes is gradually being dismantled, rule by rule and meeting by meeting. Mercedes still enters Miami with a commanding 45-point lead in the Constructors' Championship, and their drivers George Russell and Kimi Antonelli sitting first and second in the drivers' standings. Their car remains the fastest overall, and their power unit continues to show a clear edge in outright power. However, the competitive landscape that existed in the first three races is not exactly the same one that teams will face in Miami and the races that follow. The 2026 season is turning into a compelling story of technical innovation meeting regulatory response. Ferrari's choice not to copy the MGU-K trick, but instead to engage the FIA early looks increasingly smart, whether through superior intelligence gathering or an accurate prediction of how the governing body would react once safety concerns became public. The exploit that was legal and effective in Australia, China, and Japan has now been neutralized before it could deliver its maximum benefit at Miami. With the compression ratio fix coming at Monaco and possible further adjustments to energy harvesting parameters also on the horizon, the remainder of the season will test whether these incremental changes can transform what has so far looked like a Mercedes procession into a genuine multi-team championship battle. The answers will start becoming clearer this weekend in Miami, where the long final straight will no longer offer the same hidden advantage it once promised. The game of regulatory cat-and-mouse in Formula One continues, as it always has, and 2026 is proving to be no exception.